to be chazanis, or chazanut. And the chazan is the leader of the prayer service, known as a cantor in contemporary English. But what happened was, by the time that immigrants were coming from Eastern Europe to the United States, they lived on the Lower East Side of Manhattan in the early 1900s. Just like there were secular songs being sung in Yiddish, there were also cantors giving concerts, and these concerts were more popular than the services themselves. And the music in a cantorial concert would be liturgical music, but a lot of people will describe chazanis as liturgical Jewish art music, which sounds like somewhat of an oxymoron. How can you have something that's both liturgical and art? But that's the question. And play a quick little excerpt. So in the picture we have, this is cantor Gershon Soroto, whose career started in Warsaw. He came to the United States for a short period of time. And the man standing next to him was the choral director of his synagogue in Warsaw, Leo Lowe. And just that idea of having a choral director in a synagogue, even today, you don't typically see that in your average Orthodox synagogue, and you're only going to see it in any synagogue if they have the budget to afford it. It's not something very common, and it wasn't something that existed throughout Jewish history. Here's a little excerpt from an album that they recorded. In 1909, the technology wasn't quite up to the standard that it is today. But this selection uses the Frege scale, which many people consider to be the quintessential sound of Jewish music. And So that was an album that was recorded of cantorial music, music meant for the synagogue, using a synagogue choir, but it was recorded as an album for people to listen to in their homes. And it really would strike you if you've never listened to cantorial music before. Why would people want to listen to this in their spare time? Why would anyone want to record it? And two of the guiding questions for the evening. What are the Jews? Are the Jews a nation, a religion, something else? The reason we ask this is because it would make sense that a nation would have a national sound. And we listened earlier to Romania, which is a totally secular selection. But this is considered to be Jewish in some way. So in order for that to be considered Jewish, it wouldn't be Jewish religion, but having to do with some kind of a Jewish culture. And where do we get this idea from? You're talking about a group of people that has had so many influences for thousands of years. And then question of art music, we've said it's something that's not folk music, not necessarily something that you could sing amongst your friends, but something that you would go to see in a concert. And then we have the cantorial music, which is a religious form of art music. And it's something that we wouldn't expect of other cultures necessarily. The two people I chose to put on this slide are Gustav Mahler and Shalom Dovber of Lubavitch. And these are two people who lived roughly around the same time, end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, never met each other, never wanted to meet each other. And both of them wrote melodies. Both of them were born Jewish. The melodies sounded very different. Neither one of them would necessarily be considered to be composers of Jewish art music, which was coming into formation during the end of their lifetimes. So I thought it was interesting to see. So Mahler is somebody that I often will come back to because he was born Jewish, ended up having to convert to Christianity at a point of his life. And for many, he's considered to be one of the most successful Jewish composers, musicians that ever lived. He's somebody who's revered in classical circles, but nonetheless, in some way, he was not able to write what we would call Jewish music. And he was encouraged from early on to avoid that part of his life and become something else. So in order to get to that, we begin with pre-modern Europe, various empires that you can see. And the map on the right shows patterns of Jewish expulsions, migrations within Europe at the time before the Enlightenment, between the Middle Ages and the 1600s or so. The most important classification for somebody living in Europe was by their religion. And the idea of religion, using the word religion as something, as a belief system, wasn't even so much considered. It was you were Christian if you were living in Europe. People thought of this whole area as Christendom. And if you weren't Christian, then you were something else. And you had to have some kind of a status. So the map of expulsions is there to show you that Jewish communities were often welcomed into a country for a period of time. established themselves, and then either at their own will or by the will of the kingdom went away and moved somewhere else. And Jews gradually moved from Western to Central and Eastern Europe for the most part. And then the Enlightenment comes along, and this is significant for a couple of reasons. One, that the idea, John Locke proposed the idea that religion could be something that you choose. And from there, you get that you're not born into a particular religion. Somebody who's born Jewish could choose to leave the community. Somebody who's born Christian could choose to leave their community. And we now have a larger question, because if you can't be classified according to religion, how do we classify people? And another effect of the Enlightenment was the nature of classical music. Classical music being something that was written for the stage and not for the church. That was new to Christian society as it was to Jewish society, and it didn't get to Jewish communities initially, but you had composers writing music for the concert, for instruments, art music, art songs became a thing. And this enabled eventually people like Mahler and others to participate in the making of secular music, regardless of their religion. But the music had to live up to a certain standard. We at Muhlenberg recently implemented a revision of the music curriculum, and one of the things that was being discussed at the time is that the system of tonal music that we've all grown to appreciate actually is fairly new. It's something that came into formation at the end of the 1700s. So with the existence of secular concert music, you have new access to livelihood, to culture, that's people coming from different backgrounds to enjoy, but you also have the pressure to live up to a certain style. And as I asked earlier, if you couldn't be classified by religion, how would you be grouped? And the answer to that is in the form of the nations. And French revolutions, the late 1700s, German states united in the 1800s, the Italian states that were once divided, united at a certain point in the 1800s, and you have smaller nations, language-based nations coming into formation. And with this comes the idea of a new culture, a new set of standards that people become proud of, and brings us back to our question of where Jewish people fit in this. Many were eager at the opportunity to become a part of the secular nation and conform to the standards in whatever way that may be, and others felt that it was a violation of religious beliefs. We have a gentleman named Moses Mendelssohn. Dr. Cooper, we want to show what you call Moses Mendelssohn.
He's the naked Morad of Jewish history.
Naked Morad of Jewish history. You can ask questions about that later. But Mendelssohn is a misunderstood figure because he actually lived his life by today's standards as what we would call an Orthodox Jew, and he lived at a time when there weren't any denominations of Judaism, but he sat in a lecture of Kant and got people's attention, because what is a Jew doing in the lecture of Immanuel Kant? How can he understand what's going on? But Mendelssohn had a vision of Jewish life and being able to keep the commandments, using the Torah, the traditional Jewish law, as a foundation for life, while embracing the Enlightenment in some way. And he doesn't live to really see the effects, but we have different denominations of Judaism that come into being as a result of his legacy. There were synagogue reformations that took place, the implementation of an organ and a choir. That's what's most significant to this presentation. Traditionally on the Sabbath, Jews don't play musical instruments. So having an organ in the room was controversial. And having the choir, if it was a men's choir, it could be okay. If it was a mixed choir, there were complications because of prohibition from women's voice being used in public in front of men. But the synagogue also developed a different status during the Enlightenment, which I think is significant to the development of the musical culture as well, because there's an idea in traditional Judaism that we're all in exile. And even though, even by today's standards, the state of Israel was established in 1948, but there's still a belief in Orthodox Judaism that Jews are in exile and they're not where they're supposed to be. Jews are only where they are currently temporarily. And if you're only in a place temporarily, you're going to invest in a fancy synagogue. In fact, the word synagogue, you'll often hear the word synagogues and temple used interchangeably. But Orthodox synagogues typically, sometimes they are, but typically are not called temple. And the reason for that is because the temple refers to something very particular. The temple is in Jerusalem. Jews pray for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. That's more of a permanent structure. In fact, the synagogue wasn't even the main center of Jewish communities in the Middle Ages. It was really the house of study. People would sit, and the men would sit and learn the religious texts all day, and when it would come time to pray, they would pray. There were certain melodies that they would use that were traditional, but it wasn't necessarily a big spectacle. It wasn't something that everybody came to see in such an exciting form. But with Reform Judaism in Germany in the 1800s, you have the word temple starting to get used to refer to a synagogue. And these new temples were made to look like cathedrals. They were supposed to be these grand structures. They sometimes would have an organ. The bima, the place where the leader of the service would stand, was moved to the front of the room like a stage. If you go today, some Orthodox synagogues will look like that. Some will have the leader standing in the center of the room. But when you have someone on a stage, it definitely changes their role. It makes them more of the star, so to say. And this, while it seems like something very simple, it actually was quite controversial. There was a famous rabbi called the Khatam Sofer, and he was so against having the bima look like a stage that he actually left it in his will that all of his followers should never ever step foot in a synagogue if the bima is in the front of the room like a stage. And the rabbi at Sons of Israel here in Allentown actually once mentioned that there have been people who have come by the synagogue looking for service, but when they see that the stage is in the front of the room, they leave because they are strictly adhering to the Chatam Sofer's wish. So it's not a large group of people, but there is still a following that believes this. And for the implementation of music, a stage is definitely more effective if you want to get across that large sound. And this is Isaac Mannheimer, who was the former rabbi in Vienna. And he hired a music director by the name of Zalman Zaltzer. And Zaltzer was not, he wanted to implement, he said, a more refined sound to the traditional Jewish spaces. He said the old tunes and singing modes, which became national, the modes became more significant than the text he's arguing, should be improved. And they should be adjusted according to the rules of art. But also new musical creation should not be avoided. And for that purpose, he hired some composers to help him out, the most famous of whom was Franz Schubert. Schubert was not Jewish, but there is a setting of Psalm 92, Tov Lahodos, which Schubert wrote for the synagogue, for Zaltzer's congregation. And that says two things. One, there's the controversy of having somebody who's not Jewish writing music for the synagogue, but also it speaks to just how well respected Zaltzer's choir was. He was able to give the synagogue a choir that Franz Schubert, who had a pile of commissions waiting, no doubt, he was willing to write for Zaltzer's choir above other groups. And he did it just before he died, actually. And Zaltzer was very, very successful. He served in the synagogue in Vienna for more than 60 years. And he was successful because people liked the choir, and people who may have gone away from organized religion at the time of the Enlightenment were starting to come back to synagogue because they were excited by Zaltzer. And that was exactly his goal, was to make the synagogue an exciting place. And some of you might be familiar with at least two of Zaltzer's melodies. The one I have over here, Vayehi bin Saharon, Vayomer Moshe, Kuma Adonai v'afutso yevacho, ve'anusu misanecha mipanecha. That's a melody that is used in most synagogues in the United States when removing the Torah from the Ark. It is written in pretty standard major scale, doesn't necessarily have anything what we would consider to sound overwhelmingly Jewish based on the pieces we listened to earlier tonight. So it begs the question of if he was doing the right thing. People were coming to synagogue and people were excited. And the other famous melody that Zaltzer wrote, Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad, which every child learns today growing up. There are definitely more children singing Zaltzer's Shema Yisrael than there are Lebedev's Romania. And from a religious perspective, it's also because the Shema is the declaration of faith. It means, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. It's something that Jews commanded to recite twice a day to affirm the oneness of God, the cornerstone of the religion. But at the same time, the melody that is used in most places today comes from this Western European tradition that Zaltzer was trying to match. It's not what we would call a Misinai melody. There are a lot of melodies in the synagogue that nobody knows who wrote them. I'm sure many of you didn't know that Zaltzer wrote Shema Yisrael and Vayi bin Soah. And we tend to think that these melodies come from Mount Sinai. They were taught to Moses at Mount Sinai. I wasn't, well, there's an idea that we were all there, but I can't remember what melodies were taught at Mount Sinai. So it may have been, but it's probably was not. It was written in the 1800s, and it was written based on scales and choral formats of the surrounding peoples. But in addition to Zaltzer's choir, there was his persona. And you see over here the picture of Zaltzer. He's wearing a nice outfit. That hat was not worn by cantors before Zaltzer. It is based on the hat that Catholic bishops would wear. And Zaltzer thought it would bring a sense of elegance, decorum to the synagogue. So he started wearing it, and a bunch of people really liked that he was wearing it. Other cantors, other chazanim throughout Europe idolized Zaltzer, and more importantly, they envied Zaltzer. They wanted to wear such a hat. Who doesn't want to wear such a hat? When I led the high holiday services this past fall, I made sure that I was wearing such a hat. So there, we go to Eastern Europe, and we're going to get to how Eastern European cantors reacted to Zaltzer, but just a little bit about what was going on in Eastern Europe at this time, because so far we've been talking mostly about Germany and Austria. The Russian Empire was a little bit more difficult for Jews to live in than Austria-Hungary. There were certain restrictions that were in place. Different czars in the 19th century implemented different levels of restrictions, but generally Jews had been confined to one particular area, what we call the Pale of Settlement. They were made to serve long sentences in the military at a certain time, and they were forced to join these programs, what was called programs of Russification. And these programs were meant to implement the Russian culture, Russian language, and religion amongst minority peoples. It wasn't just the Jews who were suffering here. There were many minorities living in the Russian Empire. And current events, this all sounds too familiar. But within Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, what people who know something about Jewish communities in Eastern Europe might tell you about two different groups within the Jewish community. And it started in early 1700s with a man called the Baal Shem Tov, by Israel ben Eliezer. And he started the Hasidic movement. And this was a movement which offered a different approach, a more mystical approach to Judaism, valuing singing and dancing as traditions just as much as praying and studying. And there, in the 1800s, Jews were often grouped as the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim. That means people who followed the Baal Shem Tov, people who followed Hasidus, and people who didn't, people who were against it. There always has to be somebody who's against you in Judaism. From a whole movement based on just being against one person. So one piece which I learned while doing this project is that Hasidic rabbis, Rebbeim they're called, a Hasidic Rebbe is often given a sort of holy status. The Rebbe has followers and people revere him, do as he does. The man in the center is Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad Lubavitch movement. And often these Hasidic rabbis would implement melodies. Some of the melodies they just picked up from the local Slavic traditions. They would implement certain dances which they picked up, and they would use them for religious purposes. They sometimes sang them to words, sometimes didn't. Sometimes they changed them up a little bit. We don't have so many sources to see exactly where each melody came from, but it is known that certain Ashkenazi wordless melodies were adapted from local groups. And this actually upset some of the Misnagdim greatly, because a lot of Ashkenazic melodies had been standardized for a few hundred years, thanks to a man called the Maharil, whose book is on the left, who standardized the Nusach Ashkenaz, the Ashkenazic prayer tradition. He would go around Europe singing certain melodies. And the point to get from here is that a lot of the Eastern European Jewish traditions, the traditions that led to songs like Romania, and the works of Chazanis, were actually created over time based on different influences. The augmented second is something that is so characteristic of Jewish music, but initially it may not have been in the Jewish repertoire, though it's also important to acknowledge that Jews historically come from the Middle East and may have had some influence from the Maqamat, the Arabic mode system, though the Arabic modal system also influenced Southeastern Europe to some extent, which may have creeped its way into Eastern Europe and then into Jewish communities. So there are various origin stories for the augmented second. We don't really know how it entered the tradition. The oldest Jewish melodies, the oldest melodies which we can date, are actually not the ones that have augmented seconds. But we know that it came into the tradition at some point, and these modes acquired a certain level of significance. So Eastern European cantors, as I said, they look at Zaltzer and they say, I want to be like him. I want to wear such a nice hat. I want to have a choir. So the first chazan who implemented in Eastern Europe an organized choir was Baruch Shor. Baruch Shor lived from 1823 to 1904, served most of his career in a community in Lvov. He had acquired a secular music education in his teen years. He grew up in the synagogue and he studied with other chazanim, but he married a woman. He got married when he was 13, as people did in those days in Jewish communities. And his wife came from a wealthy family in Romania, and they sent him to Bucharest to a conservatory because they saw that he had talent. And that was one of the first times somebody from a more insular Jewish community, Baruch Shor came from a Hasidic community, that somebody from that community went to a conservatory. And what he did was he came back to the pulpit, to the synagogue, and he wrote choral melodies for the synagogue. Some of them were his own, some of them were based on pre-existing melodies. Many of them were based on the mode that was used for the service. And that was very important to Shor. Shor talked about, it's not even just a Jewish musical tradition, but specifically a Galician musical tradition. Galicia is the part of southeastern Europe between Poland and Ukraine, where many Jews were living during this time, many Hasidim were living during this time. And Shor felt that there was a significant musical tradition to this community, and he wanted to make sure that that stayed intact. So he had structured choral music, as you can see by the way that that looks, with people singing together in somewhat of a time, though less so than in Zaltzer Synagogue, because Shor did not have the luxury of an organ. But he made sure to maintain the traditional modes. And Shor, as opposed to our later Chazanim, we were listening earlier to Gershon Soroda, who recorded an album of his work and gave concerts. Shor did not perform his compositions on the stage. He did not perform his sacred compositions on the stage. He didn't go conducting his choir for concert audiences. But there was, in the 1870s, the emergence of the Yiddish theater and a secular Jewish culture. And this was a culture based on the musical traditions, the same ones that Shor grew up with and that he valued, that he used in his choral music. So Shor saw from this an opportunity to become well known, not just in the synagogue, but also as a composer of opera. And he wrote an operetta called Samson and Delilah in Yiddish. And he sat, had a performance once, and he gave a standing ovation, as a composer does at the end of a good performance. But some people heard that he publicly made an appearance at a place where women were singing in public, and that was a no-no. So Shor was suspended from his synagogue. He was offended. He went back. He went to New York for a few years, served in the synagogue in the Lower East Side until people in Europe missed him. They begged him to come back to Lvov. So he spent the last few years of his life in Lvov. And legend has it that he died in the middle of the Musaf service on Pesach, the additional service for Passover, while chanting the words Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King. His soul then left him. And you can see from that there's a certain kind of almost fairy tale type nature that goes with Eastern European cancers. And that's part of how the tradition has been kept alive, is this level of sentimentality, attachment to tradition and story. But Shor had to leave the synagogue as a result of his involvement in the secular culture. But as cantors were becoming more infatuated by Zaltzer, and more cantors wanted to have his level of stardom, they started to think not only about the choir, but also about their own voices. And then there became an argument over the idea of recording cantorial music. The man on the left, Pinchas Minkowski, was very against recording cantorial music. He believed that the music was meant for the synagogue only, and it would be an insult and appropriation to record it, to sing it outside of the synagogue. But Zavel Kvartin and Gershon Soroda wanted to record the music. And by the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, they were doing just that. And the model of a cantor and a choir was very common. The choir, as we heard with Sirota's Hamechadesh Betuvo, that we were listening to at the beginning, the choir often echoed the cantor, never interrupted, never interfered. The cantor was definitely the star of the show. And because of that, cantor and choral director, sometimes they had an adversarial relationship. Soroda and Love did not always get along. But the choir certainly helped to create a sound that was more full, especially if you didn't have an organ. Though, of course, when you recorded, you could have accompaniments, even if you were working in an Orthodox synagogue, because you were going to record, presumably not on Shabbat or holiday. So this all turned the music into something more full for people to listen to. And we end in the United States. Those of you who have been to my apartment at Muhlenberg know that I have a picture of Yossele Rosenblatt in my living room. And Yossele is considered almost unanimously to be the greatest cantor who ever lived. He had a range. He was able to hit the notes that few were able to hit in full voice. And he also composed all of his own stuff. And he was already, he was American, he was wearing a top hat. But Rosenblatt, it started with Quardin and Sirota selling albums. And in the United States, especially, you could make money from selling albums. And money is good. So Rosenblatt was recording, he was giving concerts. And some of you might know Yossele Rosenblatt because he made an appearance in The Jazz Singer. That's where that concert poster is from. But what's interesting is that you also had cantors singing Zaltzer's compositions in these concerts. And they did it with a different style. And I wish I could find more recordings to show to you. But they definitely played with tone a little bit more than Zaltzer would have liked to have seen. And the people, another position, as I mentioned with Love, the position of the choral director only became more popular and more important in the early part of the 20th century in the United States. Lazar Saminsky was the man on top, was one of the founders of the Society for Jewish Folk Music. He was somebody who studied and valued the idea of there being an inherently Jewish musical tradition. But he also took a position as a synagogue musical director at Temple Emmanuel in New York, and he programmed pieces by Zaltzer, Lewandowski, and other German Reform composers who used modes that were not what he would have considered to be inherently Jewish. But at the end of the day, would Zaltzer necessarily be happy to see what the cantorial profession became in the United States, to see these concerts they were giving where they were performing music in what Zaltzer would have considered the old Eastern European style? I don't know. But he contributed with the first musical reforms in the synagogue, and by making the cantorate into this celebrity type of position. And as Eastern European and German Jewish immigrants came together in the United States, the two forms of music really became, really got on the same program. But Jewish people were attending cantorial concerts of liturgical music, and the synagogue was lively. The concert stage was even more popular. So Zaltzer probably would have spent more of his free time attending orchestral concerts in Vienna rather than Jewish art music, but you can appreciate that the genre of Jewish art music and cantorial music came to be over time through a variety of conflicting influences. But this is what it became, and concerts continue to be performed today. So that, I thank you all for listening, and I want to thank Jessica Cooperman, Cassie Hartford for advising this project, for working so patiently with me since last June. This is the culmination of 10 months of research, perhaps too much research. You can tell me if you were too bored tonight. And I'm grateful to Mazer family for providing the funding for the grants, and to Muhlenberg for continuing to provide these amazing research opportunities for students to work independently with professors. It's something that you don't have in every college, and I encourage students in the room and to tell your friends to find out about research grants and do things like this. Thank you.
We just wanted to say that we have a couple minutes for questions. If anybody has questions, I'm going to invite you to direct them directly to Mark.